Tonight on Primetime Politics, a question of housing.
If you won't have a carbon tax election, why don't we have a housing tax election?
The Conservative leader dares the Prime Minister to have an election on housing plans, and in response, Justin Trudeau raises a question about security.
Why has the Leader of the Opposition chosen to not get a security clearance?
Coming up, we will speak with the government House Leader about that exchange and what it says about the level of debate that exists right now in the House. Also, we'll get an assessment of the Conservative housing plan from the expert who helped advise the Prime Minister on that exact same topic. Plus,
we're calling for them to repeal the carbon tax.
Carbon tax, vaccine mandates, and transgendered kids. We'll look at the policies Premier Danielle Smith is revisiting ahead of a leadership review. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Pierre Poilievre's housing proposal took center stage in the House of Commons today. Unveiled Monday, the Conservative plan would eliminate the GST on new home sales under $1 million. A proposal that Conservatives say would allow potential buyers to save thousands and boost home builds. It's also a policy that Pierre Poilievre says Canadians should vote on in what he's now calling a housing tax election.
West End Builders Association stated that my common sense Conservative plan to axe the sales tax on new homes under $1 million is, and I quote, the most significant housing announcement made in the past 2 decades. Removing the GST shows leadership to cut crippling levels of taxation on new housing, puts money directly back in the pockets of Canadians while combating the housing crisis. Why won't the Prime Minister listen to the people who build homes so that we can reverse the crisis he caused? Why don't we axe the sales tax on new homes today?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You know, it shows leadership, Mr. Speaker, taking seriously the safety of Canadians.
Exactly.
Mr. Speaker, the RCMP has concluded that the government of India was involved in the killing of a Canadian on Canadian soil, in extortion, in violence, in drive-by shootings, in home invasions, and the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada refuses to get his security clearance so that he can keep Canadians safe, can even keep his fellow MPs safe. That's why I've asked our security services to find a way to share some information with him so maybe he can do at least a part of his job.
Well, joining us now is the government House Leader Karina Gould. Ms. Gould, thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
You know, we have a lot to talk about, not a lot of time, but I do want to start with what happened in the House of Commons today, because here you have Pierre Poilievre asking the Prime Minister about the GST on housing, and instead we heard Justin Trudeau respond with questions about Pierre Poilievre's refusal to get security clearance. Your party says Canadians want to see their government work, but can it work if the Prime Minister does not answer the questions being asked of him during QP?
Well, look, Michael, I mean, there's a really big question as to why Mr. Poilievre is not getting his security clearance. I mean, this is a man who is asking Canadians for their trust, to trust him enough to be Prime Minister, but he doesn't want to do the basic work of getting a security clearance to protect our national security. I mean, he's at the point now where he's saying that he would compromise the national security of Canadians, of informants, of security agents, of our security institutions to protect himself or to protect his party or to protect something. I mean, the question is he's hiding something and he's just refusing to be honest with Canadians. And so I think the Prime Minister's responses were incredibly important. This is something that is a matter of deep concern to all of us as Canadians. You know, it was just a couple of weeks ago that the RCMP came out and said that they have, you know, clear indications that there has been interference by India in Canada, that there have been people who, a Canadian citizen has been murdered, and there has been, you know, extortion and a whole bunch of crime associated with this that directly impacts the security of Canadians. And Mr. Poilievre doesn't want to know about it, and he doesn't want to talk about it. And that should be of extraordinary concern to every single Canadian, that he would rather hide something about himself than put the everyday security of Canadians and our national security first.
But does it create a bad optic, though? And I take what you're saying, because the security issue is something that's been raised more than once already. But here we have a key question about housing and making it more affordable. Again, if you're trying to prove relevance to Canadians, does it look bad for your party by not answering those questions?
Well, look, we have a very strong record when it comes to housing. I mean, when our first mandate in 2017, we put forward the National Housing Strategy, and we have put forward, really important measures to make housing more affordable and to build more homes. And the Prime Minister did answer a number of those questions when it came to housing affordability. And what he did is he pointed out that what Mr. Poilievre often does, and what he's done in this instance, is he doesn't tell the full story. I mean, he's talking about one element of his plan, but in order to do that, he also has to cut billions of dollars from communities who need that money to build the infrastructure, to reduce the red tape, to actually enable those homes to be built. And so the Prime Minister absolutely answered the question a number of times, but he posed a really important question back to Mr. Poilievre, and that is, why will he not get his security clearance? What is it that he's hiding?
As you and I talk, it has been very interesting to watch the House since the return in September. And one issue right now that has been percolating for a month is this Conservative point of privilege. And for that to change, either your party, your government needs to produce unredacted documents on the former Green Fund, or you as government leader work with other parties to end that portion of debate. Are you pursuing either option seriously right now?
Look, what the Conservatives are doing in the House of Commons right now is just plain wrong. They are trying to use their extraordinary powers, and they're abusing those powers of the House of Commons, of parliamentarians, to get around due process, to get around the judicial process in Canada. Just yesterday in the Hill Times, a former senior official in the Parliamentary Law Clerk's Office said it's time for them to admit they were wrong and to get on with the business of governing. He said this is an abuse of power, and it sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for Parliament to request documents not for its own use, but to be given to a third party. And he said that that could actually create a constitutional issue, and that the courts would have the ability to rule against that. So, it's time for the Conservatives to stop playing these games, and quite frankly, they're dangerous games, because they're playing their political games on the backs of Canadians. They're playing with the rights of Canadians. They're playing with our democratic institutions and the very important separation of powers in our country for their own political vendettas, and that's not okay. And frankly, I would expect that if the situation were reversed, I would hope that if the Conservatives were in power and they had an opposition party that's doing what they were doing, they would be acting the same way that we are, because we have an obligation to protect people's rights, to support due process, and to respect the very important separation of powers that we have in this country. And frankly, I think that's what Canadians expect of us. So what the Conservatives are doing is just plain wrong. They need to stop so that we can get on with the business of governing.
Well, it does lead us to an important question right now, because the level of debate, people are watching across the country, not impressed by what's happening in the House. It does raise the speculation of possible prorogation. Will that happen anytime soon?
No. No, look, Michael, we are here to work for Canadians. There is only one political party in the chamber behind me that is trying to make a mockery of this place, and that does not have respect for our Parliament. It does not have respect for our democracy. And what that means is the Conservative Party of Canada and its members of Parliament and its leader do not have respect for Canadians. Because ultimately what we do in this place is about standing up for the rights of Canadians. It's about working for Canadians. And it is only the Conservative members of Parliament who are making a mockery of the work that we are supposed to be doing here for Canadians. And quite frankly, they should be ashamed. And Canadians should be, concerned about what they are doing here, because they're abusing the powers, the extraordinary powers granted to members of Parliament, not to do parliamentary work, but to try and go around due process and the really important legal structures that we have that protect Canadians in our country.
Minister Gould, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time this evening.
My pleasure. Always good to talk to you.
And you. Well, outside the politics, let's talk about this Conservative proposal. We're now joined by Mike Moffatt. In addition to being the founding director of Place Centre at the Smart Prosperity Institute, he has also advised the Trudeau government in the past on housing policies. Mike Moffatt, thank you for joining us again.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, you know, I've been reading some of your reaction or assessment of this plan, and you're rather bullish on what has been proposed here by Mr. Poilievre. You wrote that the proposal is the boldest middle-class housing proposal released to date from any federal political party. How would this type of move make housing more accessible and affordable?
Well, it basically gives a 5% cost cut to any new home under $1 million, because that's the value of the GST. There is an existing housing rebate that new home buyers can get some of the GST back that they pay, but this hadn't been updated since 1991, and the maximum home value that makes you eligible for rebate is only $450,000. So basically, it doesn't exist in much of the country because you're not going to be able to get a home for that much. So what the Poilievre Conservatives are doing is saying, okay, we're going to increase that maximum from $450,000 to $1 million, and we're going to make it so that you get all of the GST back that you would normally have to pay, not just a portion of it. So this is going to put $4 billion a year back into the pockets of first-time home buyers. Okay, or new home buyers, I should say.
Yeah, new home buyers. Except, you know, I'm from Toronto. I've lived and worked in Vancouver. When you talk about $1 million, that doesn't really get you a home that can accommodate a family in those cities. Oftentimes, you're talking about a studio or a bachelor apartment, maybe a one-bedroom, a junior one-bedroom at that price range. So it could help individuals, but what about families?
Well, yeah, and I think that's actually the biggest kind of downside to this plan. That I actually think it works in most of the country where, you know, you would be able to get a family-sized home for under $1 million. But we know there are two markets in particular where that doesn't work, and that's the Greater Toronto area and Greater Vancouver area. So I would have liked to see this cap raised to about 1.5 million rather than 1 million. That's the value of that the federal government has put on being able to access an insured mortgage. So while I don't think this is a perfect plan, I would like to see that cap raised a little bit, and there can be maybe a bit of a phase out there. You know, it is a good plan, but yeah, we need to tweak it a little bit to make it work for both Toronto and Vancouver.
Okay, adjustments, but when you talk about adjustments, I'm wondering about protection as well, because I wonder if this policy might, for example, drive up the price of housing if builders incorporate any tax relief into the price that they charge for homes.
You know, well, certainly, you know, builders and developers are going to try and maximize their profits, and you know how they're going to do that is by building more homes, by you know, looking at this kind of increased demand and create more inventory. So the Conservatives are estimating that this will help create an extra 30,000 homes a year. We haven't run the numbers here, but that seems like a plausible estimate. But yeah, I think it is fair to say that builders and developers will capture part of this value, but it'll get more homes built. That right now, builders and developers in much of the country aren't able to make sales at all. They don't really have that much pricing power. You know, we've seen the condo market all but collapse in Toronto and Vancouver. So I think what this is going to do is give buyers a little bit more buying power. So I do think that they're largely going to benefit from this because, again, in much of the country, we're not seeing that builders and developers have all that much pricing power right now.
Okay. Now, to pay for this program, Mr. Poilievre says that he would essentially collapse the Liberal home programs, namely the Housing Accelerator Fund and the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund. Would those be needed if people just had more money to buy homes through these tax cuts?
Yeah, I think we should keep those policies. They're not; those programs aren't working as well as they should. They're meant to incentivize municipal behavior, incentivize creating the conditions to build homes at the municipal level. The infrastructure fund, for instance, requires requires cities to freeze development charges. We've seen the city of Ottawa increase development charges twice in the last 6 months. So unfortunately, municipalities are kind of thumbing their nose a little bit at some of the requirements, and it's really making these programs not as effective as they should be. But I would like to see them reformed rather than thrown out entirely, because I actually think they work really well together, where the GST cut helps people actually afford a home. And these other programs like the Housing Accelerator and the Infrastructure Fund allow cities to create the infrastructure to make sure that these neighborhoods can get built in the first place.
Okay, so you'd like to see both the proposal being put forward by Mr. Poilievre as well as what's already existing on the Liberals to coexist. But if you actually look at what's being offered here by Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trudeau, because it seems to be a choice that they're offering at this point, which would get more people into homes that they can actually afford?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a wash. I think the Conservative plan creates more affordability. It puts more money in people's pockets. So I think the Conservative plan does more to make middle-class housing more affordable. I do think, these other policies that they're presently constituted, I don't think they necessarily create more or less housing than the GST plan. But again, what I would like to see is the federal government, credits Poilievre with a good idea. Say, you know what, we're going to take that idea, we're going to tweak it, maybe push it up to 1.5 million. And do these things. That we have dug ourselves such a hole when it comes to housing. We need a wartime-like effort to address the housing crisis. We need every tool possible. So this needs to be an and conversation, not an or conversation. Mike
Moffatt, appreciate the time once again. Thank you for that.
No, thank you for having me.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. People in Quebec will now be allowed to request in advance medical assistance in dying or MAID. The provincial law, which passed last year, goes into effect today, and it permits people diagnosed with incurable illnesses like Alzheimer's to request the procedure while they're still able to give consent. The federal government had asked Quebec to wait before implementing the law to allow for more consultations, but were ignored. Ottawa says it will not challenge Quebec in court. Instead, national consultations will begin Friday to consider extending the practice to the rest of Canada. In Toronto, the Ontario government released its fall economic statement. Introduced by Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy, the statement says the 2024-25 deficit has shrunk by $3.3 billion since the provincial budget in March. The statement also includes a plan to send every Ontario taxpayer and child under 18 a $200 rebate check early next year.
I think the relief has to happen now. And that's why I'm giving back $200 for every taxpayer in Ontario, plus $200 for every child under 18. That's some 15 million people that will get a $200 check, some $3 billion at a time that they need it most. And so I think this is going to go a long way helping those families struggling with the cost of living.
Premier Doug Ford defends spending the money, saying it will help offset the high cost of living and the carbon tax. All of this coming amid speculation the Premier may call an early provincial election.
We're often asked what keeps us up at night. Well, pick the page.
The Canadian security establishment released a report today outlining cyber threats to Canada. The report says state-sponsored actors are becoming more aggressive. They're concerned that they are combining computer network attacks with online information campaigns meant to intimidate and share public opinion. The report also says Chinese state-sponsored hackers have stolen valuable government information and have compromised at least 20 networks associated with Ottawa. The CSE says China's cyber program is the most sophisticated and active in Canada, while also naming Iran, India, North Korea, and Russia as cyber threats. And finally, there are just 6 days left until the U.S. election. Both the Harris and Trump campaigns held rallies in North Carolina today, a key swing state with 16 electoral college votes that Trump won in the past 2 elections. The Harris campaign was on the defensive today as well after President Joe Biden called supporters of Donald Trump garbage during a conference call yesterday. Biden tried to walk back the statement, saying garbage was a reference to controversial comments made at Trump's Sunday rally, not people. But Harris still had to answer questions about the issue.
First of all, he clarified his comments, but let me be clear, I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for.
Well, the Alberta Premier has had a very busy week on Monday, unveiling proposals to amend the province's Bill of Rights that would neutralize government vaccine mandates, expand property rights, affirm gun rights, and broaden what freedom of expression would apply to, not to mention levying a broad stroke against the Trudeau government by announcing a court challenge to its home heating oil carbon tax exemption.
The entire argument that the federal government made about why they needed to impose a federal retail carbon tax was to create fairness across the country. This clearly does not create fairness, and it in fact exempts one of the highest emitting fuels. So they've undermined their entire argument. And if their argument is that it's an affordability issue, well, it's an affordability issue for us too. So we think that they've opened themselves up to a challenge on it.
Well, to put this into context for us, we're now joined by Rick Bell, columnist for Post Media. Rick, always good to have you on the program. Thank you for being here.
I love being here. And on top of it, it's the day before Halloween. And, you know, we can talk about scary stuff if you want. No problem.
Okay, well, let's focus on the series because, you know, for people who don't know or who may have forgotten, Danielle Smith, despite winning a majority last year, is up for a leadership review with her party on Saturday. And it really does seem that everything we're hearing this week is about that review. Is she in trouble in any way?
Well, I'll tell you what her people say. Her people say they're hoping for something like 75 or 80% support. So they don't think she's in trouble. But she is definitely, there's announcement after announcement after announcement reinforcing what all of the stuff we've been hearing from her since she became premier, which is very attractive to the people who supported her when she ran for leader, and she stuck with them. She's given them almost everything they've wanted, except not an Alberta pension plan yet, and we haven't declared independence from the rest of Canada. But if anybody wanted that, but they've been given, you know, more than would have been given by the former Premier Jason Kenney, more than any Conservative leader in Alberta in the past that I've known, and I've known many of them. Mm-hmm. So they should be, you know, on the face of it, they should be happy. But you know that, you know, Jason Kenney had his problems and he was ousted, and there is a tradition among Conservatives in Alberta to be hard on their leaders, no matter who those leaders are.
Hard on their leaders, and it's interesting that you mentioned Jason Kenney, because we know that, you know, the Danielle Smith's predecessor, he was opposed by that group, Take Back Alberta. Danielle Smith had the group support in the last election. So how much of what we're hearing this week are the Premier's own views, Rick, or are these views that she has essentially adopted to keep Take Back Alberta happy?
That's a very good question. But remember that she was the leader of the Wild Rose back in the day, a dozen years ago, and she ran against the progressive Conservatives. So she's always been pretty libertarian by her own admission, and she has been, in many ways, more conservative than former Premier Jason Kenney and other leaders. She's been more focusing on what she calls Alberta's sovereignty more than the others. So I think this is what her strongest followers believe, and she believes, but of course, they're also pushing her to continue to believe that and not sort of waver from that. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, and you know,
I think she's definitely not secretly a red Tory. Mm-hmm. And she's just doing this because of I think she genuinely believes in being tough on Ottawa and the protection for the unvaccinated, rights for gun owners, expanding freedom of speech, all that stuff. She's a big believer in all of that.
So a big believer, and to the things that she has talked about, we are, I guess, at this point expecting something on transgender policies this week. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, she's already said this a million times. It's not new news. The only thing she's going to say tomorrow is that they're introducing the legislation in the legislature. So it's not really nothing new, and it's what your viewers have seen across the province in other provinces. So it does talk about personal pronouns. It does talk about when you can have gender reassignment surgery. It does talk about who can compete in sports against biological females. It talks about who can and who cannot take hormone treatments, etc. So the only thing that's new is that she's actually, putting it in front of the legislature now. But
yeah, and making the announcement ahead of her leadership review. So
over and over and over again. Will it be enough? Hey, there's some resolutions that probably do want even more. We can't get into those today, but for some people, of course, it will never be enough.
Mm-hmm.
But she's definitely hitting on a lot of the themes that she won the leadership on.
Yeah, and as you say, gun rights, freedom of expression, freedom against vaccine mandates, the transgender issue, which, as you say, will finally make its way to the Alberta legislature. So if she is meeting the call of those who brought her to office, where is Danielle Smith vulnerable right now to her critics?
Well, if you mean her critics, I mean, obviously the NDP are somewhat rejuvenated because the former mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, is now their leader, and he's definitely not, I repeat, not a traditional NDPer. He's, more centrist than most of your viewers would think the NDP. He's definitely to the right of Jagmeet Singh, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And he was never part of the NDP. He got a membership and then became the leader, like bang, bang. So there's an element there. And there are people who are saying, why doesn't she focus more? Why is she focusing on these issues that her base really get excited about? The last convention, her standing ovation, the biggest ovation was over parental rights, not over balancing the budget or cutting taxes. So people want to, people are saying, well, why are we not hearing more about affordability? Why are we not getting our tax cut that was promised? What's her housing solutions? And she has talked about those things, but not to the same degree as these other things. So you could think that might mean she's vulnerable. But remember, I believe on CPAC, we talked about what her strategy was in the last election, which is to run the table in rural Alberta, to win almost all, if not all, of the legislature seats in rural Alberta, and then win some seats, not even a majority, just some seats from the two big cities. As it turned out, she got 0 seats in Edmonton. Didn't matter. She won majority government. People thought it was a crazy strategy, but when you add up the rural seats and add up some really, hardcore conservative seats in Calgary, not the majority, she was able to win. Mm-hmm. So I think they're pretty confident that they're going to win. Now, on some issues, they claim, and they have claimed publicly, like the transgender issue, that they actually do have the support of the majority of Albertans. Some of the other issues, I don't know what their polling shows about protecting the unvaccinated and no vaccine mandates. I gather that probably doesn't have as much support. But again, she's doing the political calculation that who are the people that cause trouble in the Alberta conservative movement when they're not happy? It's not urban conservatives. It's rural conservatives. They founded the Wild Rose Party and split off from the PCs. They were the ones who basically helped kill the PC dynasty of 4 decades. So she has told me time and time again that she is most concerned about keeping the rural tent together so they don't go to another option, split the vote, and let the NDP, especially under Nenshi, who's well known, take power.
And our thanks to Rick Bell in Calgary. That is our program for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow night. Until then, take care.